Hip-hop has always sold itself as invincible. The chains, the bravado, the larger-than-life persona on every album cover. But behind that armor, some of the genre's most towering figures were quietly fighting battles that had nothing to do with rival crews or industry beef. Battles against their own bodies. This is the story of 5 rap icons whose private health crises reshaped, ended, or nearly ended their lives, often while the public had no idea anything was wrong at all. We start with a case that still feels unbelievable 3 decades later. Eazy-E. Before the world knew him as the co-founder of NWA and the architect of Ruthless Records, Eric Wright was a Compton kid who'd left street life behind to build a label out of his parents' garage. He became the face of West Coast gangster rap, and by the mid-1990s he looked, by every account, like a man in his prime, strong, sharp, untouchable. Which is exactly why what happened in early 1995 caught everyone so off guard. Wright developed a violent, persistent cough, and on February 24, 1995, he was admitted to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, where he was diagnosed with HIV/AIDS. He kept the diagnosis private for weeks, finally revealing it publicly in mid-March. By then his condition had become critical. At a Hollywood news conference, his attorney read a statement on his behalf describing him as listed in critical condition in the intensive care unit at Cedars-Sinai, and admitting plainly that he had learned about the diagnosis only weeks earlier. In that same statement, Wright tried to turn his diagnosis into a warning for his young fans, saying he'd come to understand that AIDS doesn't discriminate and affects everyone. He also used his final public words to be honest about how he likely contracted the virus, acknowledging a promiscuous lifestyle and admitting that before his wife Tamika, 6 different women had become mothers to 7 of his children. On March 26, 1995, Wright died from HIV/AIDS exactly 1 month after his diagnosis at approximately 6:35 p.m. Pacific Time. He was 30 years old. The speed of his decline fueled conspiracy theories for years, including claims pushed by figures like Suge Knight that Wright had been deliberately infected, but no forensic evidence has ever supported that, and both his wife and infant child tested negative for HIV, consistent with a years earlier sexual transmission rather than a sudden, deliberate exposure. What's not in dispute is the impact. Eazy-E's death forced hip-hop to confront a disease it had largely treated as someone else's problem, and decades later, he remains enshrined in the genre's history, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with NWA in 2016 and honored with a posthumous Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 2024. If Eazy-E's death was sudden, DMX's was the product of decades of compounding battles. Earl Simmons grew up in Yonkers in a household marked by instability and abuse, and he later said that at 14, a mentor handed him a marijuana blunt that had secretly been laced with crack cocaine, an introduction that, in his telling, hooked him almost instantly. From there, addiction became the defining struggle of his adult life, one he was unusually candid about. He also went public with a bipolar disorder diagnosis, describing dramatic mood swings and a sense of carrying 2 different versions of himself, the private family man and the explosive public persona. The warning signs had been building for years. In February 2016, he was found unresponsive in a Yonkers parking lot. Paramedics had to use Narcan to revive him. On the night of April 2, 2021, DMX suffered a heart attack at his home and was rushed to White Plains Hospital in critical condition. He never regained consciousness. Doctors kept him on life support for a week as his family held vigil, and on April 9, 2021, with no path to recovery, the decision was made to let him go. He was 50. 3 months later, the Westchester County Medical Examiner's Office made the cause official, a cocaine-induced heart attack that cut off blood circulation to his brain. A source from that office told reporters bluntly it was cardiac arrest for a period of time, so there was no circulation to the brain, and that acute cocaine intoxication had set off the entire chain of events. Notably, an autopsy was never performed. The cause of death was determined instead through toxicology and the documentation provided by treating physicians and police. DMX's openness about addiction and mental illness, in a culture where black men rarely discussed either publicly, made him one of hip-hop's most important and most painfully honest voices on the subject. Not every story on this list ends in tragedy. Dr. Dre's very nearly did, and the way he survived it is almost as remarkable as his career. By January 2021, Dre had already conquered two industries: hip-hop production and consumer tech, after selling beats to Apple for billions. Then one morning, completely without warning, he woke up with what he later called the worst pain I ever felt, located behind his right ear. He initially tried to shake it off, planning to nap through it, until a friend of his son's insisted he go to urgent care. At the clinic, things deteriorated fast. Dre began blacking out and losing consciousness, and he was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and admitted directly to the ICU. Doctors diagnosed a brain aneurysm, and during his 2-week hospitalization, he suffered 3 separate strokes. The situation was serious enough that hospital staff barred visitors under COVID protocols, except for Dre's own family, who, as he later revealed, had been quietly called in to say goodbye because doctors believed he might not survive. He didn't know that at the time. He only knew that doctors kept telling him, "You don't know how lucky you are." When he asked what had caused it and what he could have done differently, the answer was almost nothing. Some aneurysms are simply hereditary, ticking quietly regardless of how fit or disciplined a person is. Dre posted to Instagram from his hospital bed, thanking the medical staff and assuring fans he'd be home soon. But it wasn't until a 2024 podcast appearance with James Corden that he opened up about how shaken the experience left him, saying it gave him a newfound appreciation for being alive. He made a full recovery. Just over a year after lying in that ICU bed, he was headlining the Super Bowl 56 halftime show. Then there's Nate Dogg, whose story is a brutal reminder that the most common health risks are often the deadliest ones. Nathaniel Hale built an entire career on his voice alone, the unmistakable hookman behind Warren G's Regulate, Dr. Dre's The Next Episode, and dozens of other West Coast classics. There was no rare disease or mystery diagnosis behind what happened to him. It was a slow accumulation of risk that finally caught up with his body. On December 19, 2007, Hale was admitted to Pomona Valley Hospital after suffering a stroke, which left the left side of his body weakened, though his speech and cognition were unaffected. He was released about a week later to begin rehabilitation, and doctors believed a full recovery was possible. 10 months later, on September 5, 2008, a second and far more severe stroke struck, leaving him paralyzed and unable to speak, requiring a tracheotomy tube to breathe. That second stroke effectively ended his ability to perform or communicate the way he once had. He spent the next 2.5 years largely bedridden, with friends like Warren G publicly sharing updates on small signs of progress. On March 15, 2011, Hale died in Long Beach at age 41 due to complications of the 2 strokes, including congestive heart failure. Reports at the time noted his long struggle with alcoholism as a contributing factor, and doctors have pointed to his case as part of a broader, alarming pattern. Nearly 3/4 of all strokes happen in people over 65, which means more than a quarter occur in people younger than that, a fact that makes Nate Dogg's death at 41 tragic, but, medically, far from an anomaly. His funeral drew over 1,000 mourners, and tributes poured in from Snoop Dogg, Warren G, and the wider West Coast community he'd helped define. Finally, there's Big Pun, whose story is one of the most sobering on this list precisely because nothing about it was exotic or rare. Christopher Rios became the first solo Latino rapper to go platinum with his 1998 debut Capital Punishment, a generational talent whose dense, breathless wordplay earned him comparisons to the notorious B.I.G. But behind the music, Rios had struggled with his weight for a decade, a habit rooted, by his own family's account, in using food to cope with a difficult childhood. He gained more than 500 pounds over 10 years, and despite multiple attempts to lose weight, including a stint at a Duke University weight loss program where he shed 100 pounds before quitting early and regaining it all within 4 months, the weight kept climbing. In the 2 weeks before his death, his wife Liza noticed his body beginning to visibly deteriorate, with frequent vomiting after eating and unhealthy-looking skin. On February 5, 2000, Rios withdrew from a planned Saturday Night Live performance due to illness, and 2 days later, while staying at a hotel in White Plains, New York, he suffered a heart attack and respiratory failure. Paramedics were unable to revive him. He was pronounced dead at age 28. The autopsy revealed the full scope of the toll obesity had taken on his body. Rios weighed 698 pounds at the time of his death, and his heart was roughly 3 times the normal size, according to the Westchester County Deputy Medical Examiner. His mentor and close friend Fat Joe later spoke about the guilt that lingered afterward, admitting, "We wasn't educated on nutrition. We didn't know nothing at the time." Pun's death became and remains one of hip-hop's starkest cautionary tales about the collision of fame, untreated trauma, and a health crisis that built for years in plain sight. 5 different artists, 5 completely different diseases, a virus, addiction, and mental illness colliding, a hereditary aneurysm, cascading strokes, and the long-term toll of obesity. What ties them together isn't the disease itself, but how invisible each of these battles was to the outside world until the moment it wasn't. Some of these men didn't survive their fight. Others did, and came back changed by it. Either way, their stories are a reminder that the loudest, most larger-than-life figures in music are still, underneath it all, just human bodies. And sometimes those bodies are fighting wars nobody else can see.